I've never had that special sisterly bond that you see in movies or read about in books, where two kindred spirits are connected by the same blood, as if they understand each other without words, where the eyes are full of support and unconditional love, and where the hand is always outstretched in difficult times. No, in our family everything was different, much more prosaic and, perhaps, sadder. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. Christina was already 10 years old when I was born, and there was such an age difference that it seemed we belonged to different eras, as if she was already on the threshold of adulthood, experiencing her first timid attractions and disappointments in high school, while I, carefree and naive, continued to play with dolls and dream about the fairy tale princes who lived in the pink castles of my childhood. Our parents, as is often the case with those whose children are separated by years and time, seemed especially reverent towards their firstborn, as if in their eyes Christina was perfection, an ideal in which there was no shadow of a flaw, and this deep, almost blind affection remained in them forever, having passed the years. So even when I turned 18 and went to college, deciding to stay in my hometown for the sake of saving money and peace of mind, she still remained their pride and favorite. Christina, meanwhile, was rapidly following the path chosen by many girls who dream of quiet family happiness, and soon announced her engagement to Alberto, a local accountant whom she met in the church choir, and I still remember that day as if it were yesterday, bright, filled with the sense of spring flowers. The day when she walked down the aisle, radiant and happy, in a cloud of snow-white lace, and our parents, without hiding their tears, blessed her with new happiness, while I, standing on the sidelines, quietly rejoiced that I would stay at home and be able to devote myself to my studies. But I could not imagine how much my life would change after this decision, how many trials would befall me, and how difficult it would be to keep the delicate balance between dreams and reality in my hands. Christina, as if taking the initiative from fate itself, completely immersed herself in the role of the ideal wife and hostess, and just a few months after the wedding, joyfully announced that she was expecting a child, exclaiming with delight in her voice, "Isabella, you will become an aunt," and I, caught off guard, just smiled and nodded, unaware that this news will be the beginning of an endless series of responsibilities that will imperceptibly fall on my shoulders. 3 months after the birth of little Massimo flew by like a flash, and suddenly Christina began to visit her parents' house often, without warning, without a call, as if her right to rest went without saying, "I just need a break." She was literally pushing the baby into our mother's arms, throwing him on the run. "I'll be back in a few hours," and as usual, being at home, I became her silent ally in this endless marathon of child care. In my room, surrounded by piles of textbooks and notebooks filled with notes, I was struggling to concentrate on my studies when I heard a cautious knock on the door and my mother's quiet, hopeful voice, "Isabella, darling, could you watch Massimo while I cook dinner?" And every time I put down my pen I got up, wiping my tired eyes, and walked towards the tiny creature that required my attention more than all the exams and tests combined. It became our new reality, a routine from which there was no hiding or shutting out, a time when my every attempt to immerse myself in my studies was interrupted by crying, requiring urgent intervention, or my mother's insistent, affectionate, but peremptory call for help. And when I finally began to get used to this rhythm of life, believing it couldn't get any worse, Christina, with a beaming face and a voice full of glee, announced over Sunday lunch that she was pregnant again, and that Massimo would soon become an older brother. 2 years have passed, filled with sleepless nights, moods, hospital trips, and endless screams, when, already in my senior year of college, I was desperately trying to prepare for my final exams, while 3-year-old Massimo was rushing around the house like a small hurricane, leaving chaos in his wake, and baby Jacob was crying out for screaming, demanding all the attention of the outside world. And one day, when my patience was running out, I gathered the last of my courage, went up to Christina and asked, timidly but firmly, "Christina, have you thought about hiring a babysitter?" To which she looked at me with such an expression on her face, as if I had suggested that she betray those closest to her, and said with a grin, "Do you know how much babysitters cost now? Besides, why pay strangers if we have a family?" And at that moment, Mom, chasing Massimo, who was running around the house wearing Mom's reading glasses again, just nodded, as if confirming the correctness of her words. So our house finally turned into an arena of endless bedlam, where every corner breathed chaos and fatigue, and Massimo, like a little savage, turned any room into a personal playground, knowing no barriers. One morning I woke up from a strange rustle, left the room and found that he had dumped all my folders on the floor, and he used my carefully written notes as paper for his drawings. And the youngest, Jacob, as if trying to outshout his older brother, filled the house with deafening screams from early morning until late at night, which became a constant background for me to study and relax, if you could even call it that. And one day, when I heard a loud crash and Massimo's joyful squeal from below, I heard my mother, in a voice full of desperation. She called out to me, "Isabella, honey, please help with the boys. I can't take it anymore." But this time, for the first time in my life, I screamed back, hiding behind the locked door, "I can't, Mom. I have exams in a week." "You're selfish," my father's voice, loud and angry, mingled with the general noise and chaos in which the living room was drowning, echoed in my ears with a hum of heavy reproach, and it seemed that the walls themselves were shaking from this tense exchange of words. "These are your nephews. The family must help the family," he continued, waving his arms as if he was trying to convince me by force, and I, feeling a familiar wave of anger, resentment, and impotence rise in my chest, turned on the music at full volume, hoping to at least partially drown out their accusing voices and the endless sounds of falling and crashing coming from below. My hands were shaking as I tried to concentrate, carefully emphasizing important passages in my textbook, realizing that every moment of delay was taking me further from my goal. But guilt, like a sticky web, was already beginning to entangle my thoughts, making me doubt myself. And yet I knew with what merciless clarity I understood that if I failed these exams, my entire future, my dreams, my hopes, everything I've fought for, will be jeopardized. The next few weeks turned into a grueling marathon filled with sleepless nights, endless cups of strong coffee, attempts to build at least an illusory order in the chaos of my existence. But despite the constant obstacles, despite the eternal background of shouting and running, I managed to graduate from university with honors, and this was for me the victory for which was worth fighting for. When I finally got my first job at Anderson & Associates, my first and most urgent priority was to find my own place to live, a place where I could breathe freely, without the screams and demands of others, without endless feelings of guilt. And although the starting salary was far from my dreams, it was enough to afford to rent a tiny one-room apartment on the other side of town, far from my parents' house and Christina's endless demands. That first night in my new apartment was a revelation for me. For the first time in many years, I fell asleep in complete silence, without piercing crying, without the sound of breaking dishes, without the feeling that at any moment I would have to sacrifice my plans again for the whims of others. And this blessed silence enveloped me like a warm blanket, promising that now my life really belongs to me. 2 years have passed, filled with quiet work, rare but warm meetings with friends, evenings alone with books and a cup of tea, and I managed to build a modest, but cozy and reliable existence for myself, when suddenly one day, during another weekly phone conversation with my mother, I was informed about Christina's third pregnancy, the news which seemed to take me back to the past, to the days when everything was falling apart under the onslaught of other people's expectations. "It's another boy," Mom said with a barely perceptible note of fatigue in her voice, trying to sound cheerful. "Isn't it wonderful?" she added, and I, already anticipating the increased chaos in advance, mentally sighed, but aloud I answered cautiously, "Yes, wonderful," as if repeating after her, like an echo, not wanting to reopen old wounds. "How are you and Dad coping with Massimo and Jacob these days?" I asked, realizing that the politeness on duty hid real concern. Mom paused for a moment, sighed heavily, as if she was throwing off a burden that had been weighing on her shoulders for a long time, and said, with a forced cheerfulness, "They are energetic, very energetic. Christina still brings them every Saturday and Sunday, says she needs a break, especially now that another child is coming." Her voice trailed off, and I could clearly hear the tiredness she was trying in vain to hide behind her words. On my next visit home, which I kept postponing, hoping to avoid the inevitable, I saw changes that could not be ignored. My parents looked exhausted, aged not by 2 years, but as if by a decade. Their movements were sluggish, and their eyes were tired, while Massimo and Jacob were running around with insane energy. At home, like little storms, arranging some kind of game, which consisted of methodically throwing all the sofa cushions on the floor and endless laughter. "Mom, Dad," I began, watching them bend over and pick up another pillow. "You know you don't have to do this, right? You can tell Christina no." Dad stood up heavily and turned to me, his face flushed with tension or perhaps anger, and breathing heavily. He said, "It's so selfish to say that, Isabella. This is a family. The family helps the family. There's nothing selfish about setting boundaries," I objected, trying to speak calmly, although everything inside was boiling with indignation. "You look exhausted, don't you notice that?" "You don't understand what family means," Mom replied sharply, tossing her head, and her voice was taut like a string about to snap. "When you have children of your own, you will understand everything." I left their house with a heavy heart, with a feeling of bitterness and despair, realizing that nothing had really changed in all these years. Christina still enjoyed their unconditional love, her parents still allowed her everything, and I remained the one who spoils their illusions with my presence. Over time, my visits became rare, and each visit reminded me of why I left. As soon as I entered my home, I found myself in the midst of events that looked more like a battlefield than a cozy family hearth, and Massimo, who was now 5, and Jacob, who kept up with his brother. Every meal was turned into a circus performance with obligatory food fights with a vengeance. The appearance of 6-month-old Gaspard, the third boy in this chaos, only worsened the situation. One day, at another Sunday lunch, I watched in horror as Massimo, grinning, filled his spoon with mashed potatoes and threw it with all his might at Jacob, who in response threw a handful of green peas at his brother, and Gaspard, the poor baby accidentally caught in the middle of the crossfire. He sat smearing baby food on his cheeks and crying inconsolably, while his older brothers laughed. I couldn't take it anymore. In a rage, I slammed my palm on the table, and the ringing sound made everyone stop talking and stare at me in surprise. "Massimo, Jacob, come here immediately," I said loudly and clearly, feeling every cell of my body filled with determination. They froze, clearly amazed that someone had dared to confront them, and I, without lowering my voice, pointed to the food-spattered floor, walls, and Gaspard, who burst into tears. "Look what you've done. This is unacceptable. You'll clean it up right now." To everyone's surprise, including my own, the boys really started cleaning up after themselves. Maybe it was the shock that for the first time in their lives someone dared to speak out against their unpunished chaos. Maybe it was some kind of unconscious respect for the person who finally demanded responsibility from them. But the fact remained, they were standing on all fours, grunting and muttering to themselves, and wiping the floor with dirty rags, when at that moment, like a storm, Christina burst open the door so that it hit the wall, beaming with the freshness of her weekly spa session, with a light bag on her shoulder and an expression of shocked authority on her face. "What's going on here?" she demanded, noticing her older boys, humiliatingly crawling on the floor, wiping away the traces of mashed potatoes and peas, and I, remaining calm, explained that they had made a mess during lunch and were now cleaning up after themselves, as is customary in normal families. Christina's face instantly turned red with anger, her lips pressed into a thin line, and, exclaiming in an accusing voice, "How dare you? They're just kids. You're cruel to them, Isabella, you're cruel." She looked at me as if I had committed a terrible crime, and at some point I really doubted the reality of what was happening. "Christina, they threw food at Gaspard," I replied calmly, as calmly as possible in such a situation. "He was crying, he was scared. This is not normal behavior." But Christina, lifting her chin, as if offended to the depths of her soul, spat out, "You don't have children of your own. You don't understand anything." Her voice was full of contempt, as if my lack of children made me unworthy of having an opinion about the minimum standards of decency and respect. I looked around the room, desperately hoping to find support from my parents, longing to see in their eyes at least a hint of agreement or gratitude, but they just sat there, tired, defeated, hunching their shoulders and avoiding my gaze, as if they didn't even have the strength left for the slightest resistance, and I couldn't understand why can't they tell her no. Why do they keep letting Christina use their love, their kindness, their powers? Life went on like this for 3 more long years, during which I consciously limited my visits home, choosing to maintain my own mental balance instead of participating in an endless performance of chaos and irresponsibility. And everything changed the day I met Osvaldo, the man who turned my world upside down and showed that relationships can be different, calm, warm, filled with mutual respect. He was completely different from those I knew before, smart, attentive, incredibly kind, and, most importantly, he understood the importance of personal boundaries as keenly as I did, appreciated them and respected them like a shrine that should not be trampled on. We met quite by chance in a coffee shop near my office, when he mistakenly took my latte, and instead of just exchanging banal apologies, we started a conversation that lasted for several hours in a row. Words flowed so easily and naturally between us. After 6 months of dating, we decided to introduce each other to our families, and I was surprised to discover that his parents, Robert and Diana, were wonderful people who raised their voices about as rarely as they forgot something in the oven, which came as almost a shock to me after everything I'd been through. The contrast between their peaceful, loving and understanding home and the eternal noise, fuss, and tantrums in my parents' house was so striking that at first it was even difficult for me to believe that this was actually happening. Christmas has always been a big event in our family, carefully prepared, with lots of food, loud conversations, and endless traditions. And this year it was supposed to be special, because Osvaldo and I recently got engaged, and Mom put all her efforts into making the holiday truly memorable. The tree stood in the corner, decorated with impeccable neatness. Each gift was wrapped in matching color paper, and the aromas of her legendary holiday pastries were in the air, filling the house with warm comfort. We arrived early to help, and the atmosphere was really filled with joy and anticipation. My cousins, Sergio and Sarah, were already there with their children, who were peacefully sitting in a corner and playing board games without starting any fights or shouting. Several distant relatives came from out of town, including Great-Aunt Marta who, when she saw me, joyfully exclaimed, "Let me see this ring, dear." And, taking my hand, she admired the wedding ring for a long time, beaming with happiness for me. "Osvaldo is such a sweet young man," she whispered, stroking my hand. "You will be very happy together." And at that moment it seemed to me that everything was really going the way it should be, that I had finally escaped from the enchanted circle of disorder and pain. Mom really outdid herself in cooking treats. The table was full of dishes. Dad, happy and slightly moved, told his old but always funny stories, and even the children, miraculously, behaved politely, asking for cookies with the same please and thank you, like a scene from a Christmas movie that I suddenly believed in. But this idyll was disrupted so suddenly and loudly that it seemed as if the building itself shook when the front door was flung open, and Christina's ringing voice echoed through the house, "Merry Christmas." But her greeting was immediately drowned out by the discordant roars of her 3 boys, who ran into the house like a hurricane released. Massimo, who is now 8 years old, ran into Uncle George, causing him to stagger and almost fall. Jacob, who was 6, rushed to the sofa where his cousins were quietly reading books, pushing one of the girls away, and 3-year-old Gaspard, like a siren, screamed so shrilly and for no reason that several of the guests involuntarily covered their ears. "Boys are boys," Christina laughed nonchalantly, without even thinking to apologize, while her husband Alberto, without taking his eyes off the phone screen, seemed not to notice what was happening at all, and before anyone could stop them, Massimo and Jacob noticed something under the Christmas tree. They didn't just look at the presents neatly laid out under the tree or gently shake them, as ordinary children do. No, Massimo and Jacob began indiscriminately tearing wrapping paper, tearing ribbons and boxes with frantic energy, as if it were some kind of speed contest, not even stopping in front of the gifts that were intended. By himself, and at this moment, when the air smelled of torn wrappers and the irretrievably spoiled magic of waiting, Great-Aunt Marta, watching Massimo ruthlessly tear apart a carefully wrapped gift, intended for my cousin's daughter, she threw up her hands and, gasping, said, "Oh, my God, I think I need to leave. It's too exciting for me," and, leaning on her cane, hurriedly retreated into the hallway, where several of our elderly relatives were already gathering, looking at each other with expressions of helplessness and confusion. She was far from the only one. Within 20 minutes, amid the roar and laughter of uncontrolled boys, half of our guests excused themselves and left the house, unable to cope with the chaos that my nephews had caused in a matter of moments, turning a cozy family holiday into something more like a natural disaster. The dinner that followed turned out to be even worse. My cousin's children were sitting at the same table, quiet, well-mannered, neatly arranging napkins on their laps and patiently waiting for their turn to say thank you for the food, which was in stark contrast to my nephews, who, without paying the slightest attention to adults, staged a real battle with buns, like a dinner table. The table was an arena of gladiatorial fights. Massimo and Jacob threw pieces of bread and potatoes at each other with wild joy, while Gaspard, sitting in a child's seat, happily smeared cranberry sauce on his blonde hair, creating a picturesque picture of bright spots around him, and his mother, in desperation, weakly tried to calm this madness, sobbing, "Children, please." But her pleas were drowned out by the general hum and were completely ignored. The turning point came when Massimo, with a mischievous grin that promised trouble, deliberately picked up his can of soda, lifted it high above the table and with demonstrative slowness poured its contents directly onto a special Christmas pie that his mother had prepared with love and care that morning, spending several hours at the stove to create this culinary masterpiece. Massimo. Several voices shouted at the same time, filled with horror and disbelief, but Christina, not at all embarrassed, just laughed and, waving her hand, said, "He's just joking," as if the soda pie was an ordinary and funny incident worthy of laughter, while her husband Alberto continued to sit, buried in his phone, scrolling through the pages, completely indifferent to the unfolding chaos. I looked around the table, seeing shock on the faces of my relatives, deep disapproval hidden behind polite smiles, and a growing sense of discomfort that hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and all the while my sister and her husband sat there behaving as if their children's behavior was completely normal, and the problem was with others who didn't understand fun. I couldn't take it anymore. The sight of the ruined pie, the despair on my mother's face, the chaos around me, the complete lack of discipline and respect, it was the last straw in the cup of my patience. Rising abruptly from my seat so that the chair creaked loudly on the floor, my voice trembling with anger, I said loudly, "I can't stay here. This is ridiculous. Your kids are behaving abominably, Christina, and you're not doing anything about it." There was a ringing silence at the table, broken only by the clatter of Gaspard's spoon on his plastic plate, while Christina's face turned red with anger and humiliation, and, jumping to her feet, she barked, "Oh, how nice to hear from you. You don't have children, Isabella. You can't imagine how hard it is to raise children. When you have your own, then you can judge my upbringing." I let out a bitter laugh, feeling the blood boiling in my veins, and pointed to my cousin's children sitting to the side, peeking stealthily from the table, visibly embarrassed by the whole scene. "Really? Then how do you explain the behavior of Sarah and Sergio's children? They've been fine all day. They are polite. They don't throw food around. They don't spoil other people's things. Or do you think that only your children have the right to uncontrolled chaos?" Christina, lowering her eyes, muttered something unintelligible about other children, but I couldn't stop myself and coldly retorted, "The difference is, Christina, that Sarah and Sergio are actually raising their children. They teach them respect and responsibility. When was the last time you held your children accountable for their actions?" Christina's eyes, filled with anger and resentment, suddenly became moist with tears, and, sobbing, she exclaimed, "You're so cruel. You've always hated my children." "I don't hate them," I said, trying my best to remain calm. "I hate watching them grow up without any guidance or discipline. I hate to see Mom and Dad's house destroyed every time you visit. I hate that you think this behavior is normal." At that moment, Osvaldo, who had been sitting silently next to me all this time, stood up and gently put his hand on my shoulder. His gesture was full of support and quiet understanding. "I think it's time for us to go," he said softly, and there was determination in his voice. Christina was crying all over now, sobbing into her hands, while her boys continued to run around, laughing loudly and not paying the slightest attention to the drama playing out right in front of their eyes, and Alberto, finally looking up from his phone, glanced irritably at his watch, as if he wanted to show that all this was taking away from him. "He has precious time," "Merry Christmas to everyone," I said, my voice filled with biting sarcasm as I tried to maintain some pride and headed for the exit. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I just can't look at this anymore." Osvaldo and I left, leaving behind a crying Christina and a triumphant shout from Massimo, who threw another bun across the room with a joyful cry. 2 months later, Osvaldo and I were sitting in our bright, cozy apartment, surrounded by stacks of notebooks, fabric samples, and catalogs, working on wedding planning, trying to give our special day the beauty and tranquility that we both dreamed of, and the memories of the Christmas disaster were still too vivid in our minds, like an old wound that was just beginning to heal when, going through the guest list, we stopped at the section with the names of the children, involuntarily slowing down and looking at each other, realizing that we had to make a difficult but necessary choice over this item. "They'll ruin everything," I finally said out loud what we were both thinking, looking at the lines with the names of my nephews, imagining how they might behave during the ceremony, the most important moment in our lives, or at a reception where everything was supposed to be saturated with an atmosphere of love, joy, and noble tranquility. Osvaldo nodded with understanding and suggested, choosing his words carefully, "What if we just make our wedding completely childless? No children under the age of 16, period. This way it won't look like a personal attack, it will be a general policy for all guests." I frowned, thinking about his words, because I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings, especially Sarah and Sergio, whose children behaved so decently and respectfully, but Osvaldo continued, carefully, "Some people may be offended, yes, but if the rule applies to everyone without exception, it's much more difficult to argue with this. Sarah and Sergio, of course, will be disappointed that their children will not be able to come, but at least they will understand that this is not directed against them personally." I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining the ceremony of my dreams, peaceful, without shouting, without disorder, without fights over food or torn gifts, just an elegant celebration of our love, surrounded by adult guests who can truly feel the significance of the moment. "A wedding without children," I repeated, tasting these words, feeling a quiet joy rising inside, you know. I really like it. We chose Sunday afternoon to break the news to the family, hoping that at the end of the weekend they would be more inclined to take this information calmly, but looking back, I realized that perhaps we should have waited for the moment when Christina and her children would not be at their parents' house, although to catch this rare moment, it was like trying to hold lightning in a bottle. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my parents' house, I literally had to dodge the remote control, which screeched through the air and flew inches from my head, while Massimo, chasing Jacob, completely ignored those around him, and Gaspard was sitting on the floor, crying from that his older brothers had destroyed his tower of cues for the third time in a row. "Mom, Dad," I began, raising my voice above the hubbub, "Christina, I need to talk to you about the wedding." "Of course, dear," Mom replied, at the same time trying to wipe off the sticky stain from the juice that Gaspard had spilled in the very center of the living room. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and, trying to sound confident, said, "Osvaldo and I decided to have a wedding without children. Children under the age of 16 will not be present." For a moment, silence hung in the room, almost palpable, before Christina, jumping up from the sofa with such speed, as if she had been thrown by a spring, exploded, "What?" Her voice was so loud that I flinched involuntarily. "You can't do that. What about my boys?" She was almost screaming, her face reddening by the second. "The policy applies to all children," I explained calmly, keeping my voice level, "not just yours. This is a general rule. That's because you hate them." "You've always hated my children," she accused, her eyes flashing. "You're a terrible aunt. Terrible sister." "No, Christina," I insisted firmly, even when out of the corner of my eye I noticed Massimo at that moment, as if confirming my words, knocking over a heavy vase on the floor. "I love your boys. But you saw what happened at Christmas: food fights, torn presents, ruined pie. It was just kids, Isabella. Children are like children." She screamed, defending her version of reality. "No, Christina," I replied quietly but firmly, "Sarah and Sergio's children were there too, and they didn't ruin anything. They behaved respectfully. They didn't wreak havoc. So not all children are the same. It's not about age, it's about upbringing. Oh, of course, Christina rolled her eyes, her voice rising to a screech. Those perfect kids, perfect cousins, perfect families again. Well, I said coldly, feeling a strange calmness spreading inside me, you won't have to worry about your boys ruining our precious wedding, because if you decide so, you won't be there at all. For a moment, Christina stood with her mouth open in shock, as if she couldn't believe that I had really said it out loud, but then with a new wave of rage she began to collect toys, throwing them into bags with such force, as if they were the culprits of her pain. "Come on, boys," she shouted, "we're leaving. Aunt Isabella doesn't want you in her life anymore." "That's not what I said." I began, but she was already hurrying her boys to the door, and my words were drowned out by the noise of indignant voices and sobs. "I hope you're happy with your perfect, quiet wedding." She spat over her shoulder with such fury that her words almost burned the air, and then slammed the door so hard that the windows in the living room rattled, and we were left standing in silence, broken only by the dull echo of her departure. I turned to my parents, expecting to see understanding, support, and at least the slightest hint on their faces that they realized how unfair this situation was, because for many years they themselves had endured the lawlessness and chaos emanating from my nephews, sadly watching as their once cozy home gradually turned into the arena of endless childish tantrums and destruction. But instead I found on their faces an expression of cold disappointment, and before I could say a word, Mom, with a quiet but surprisingly harsh voice, said, "How could you, Isabella?" "Mom, you saw how they behave," I tried to explain, feeling a wave of pain rise inside. "You saw for yourself what happened at Christmas." "They're just kids," Dad intervened. His voice was deaf and stubborn, as if he had prepared this answer to all my possible arguments in advance. "That you're incredibly selfish." I stood there in disbelief, feeling everything inside me shrink from resentment and misunderstanding. How could a simple request for a peaceful wedding, a day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life, be perceived as a manifestation of selfishness? "Selfish?" I asked, barely able to contain the tremor in my voice. "Is it selfish to want to spend your wedding day in peace, without food fights, without screaming children, and without constant fear of spoiling the moments? Is it selfish to want at least one day in your life to be perfect?" Dad's face turned stony, his eyes narrowed, and he said in a flat voice, in which there was not a drop of doubt, "Then you need to reconsider your decision. Either you invite your nephews, or we will not attend the wedding." These words hit me with such force that I instinctively took a step back, as if a door had slammed in front of me, behind which there was always at least some hope for support and understanding, and I looked at them, at these people who were exhausted from years of chaos themselves, at parents whose faces were prematurely covered with wrinkles from the endless stress, who endured tantrums and destruction, who complained to me about fatigue, and now threatened to miss one of the most important days of my life because I dared to want a single day of peace. "Great," I said, looking straight into their eyes, feeling an icy calm rise inside. "It's your choice. Don't come." Without saying another word, I turned around and left their house, feeling the door slam harder behind me with every step, closing the part of my life that had held me captive for so long in guilt and obligations, and drove straight to Osvaldo, where, in his bright apartment, filled with the aroma of coffee and comfort, I told him and his parents about everything that had happened. Their reaction was immediate and full of support. "You're absolutely right," said Diana, my future mother-in-law, taking my hands and looking into my eyes with sincere warmth. "You have every right to want a peaceful, beautiful wedding. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty about it." These words, simple and honest, became a balm to my soul, and that evening, with Osvaldo by my side, holding my hand tightly, I made it official. I posted an announcement on Facebook, writing, "Osvaldo and I are happy to announce that our wedding will be a celebration without children. We look forward to sharing the special day with our adult guests in an elegant and peaceful environment." And almost immediately, a wave of support began, warm and sincere. Cousins, friends, even distant relatives put likes, left comments with approval, wrote words of support. Sarah, my dear cousin, one of the few who always understood me without words, wrote, "I completely understand. We will hire a babysitter for the children for this day. I can't wait to celebrate with you and Osvaldo." Her words warmed my heart and strengthened my confidence in the correctness of my decision. But, of course, it wasn't without Christina, whose comment appeared with frightening predictability. "Shame on you, Isabella. You're tearing the family apart with your selfishness. You've always been jealous of my children, and now you're excluding them from this important family event. I hope you're happy with yourself." I was already preparing for another wave of accusations, but the response was so quick and powerful that even I was amazed. The relatives who witnessed the Christmas disaster, one by one, stood up for my defense. Or maybe instead of attacking Isabella, one of the distant aunts wrote, "You should focus on raising your children. Your boys ruined the whole Christmas dinner," the cousin added. "They tore up the presents, started a food fight and forced half the family to go home early." Even great-grandmother Marta, who usually avoided conflict, intervened, leaving comment after comment, each of which retold another episode of my nephew's ugly behavior and the complete absence of any interference from their parents. The post turned into a veritable catalogue of years of chaos, destruction, and silent patience that finally snapped. Each comment was evidence that the problem was visible to everyone except Christina herself. And for the first time in many years, Christina fell silent. Her answers stopped abruptly, as if she suddenly realized that this time she had nothing to justify herself with, that the whole family, together, unanimously, finally sided with common sense. My phone rang 3 days after a real whirlwind of emotions and comments broke out on social media under my post, and when I saw my mother's name on the screen, my heart involuntarily squeezed, as if anticipating a new round of disappointment or reproaches. But despite the fear, I still answered, clutching the phone in a sweaty palms. "Isabella," Mom's voice was soft, strangely cautious, almost trembling. "Your father and we saw your post and all the comments. We had no idea that so many people felt the same way." She hesitated, as if choosing her words, seeing how everyone described what happened at Christmas and other times. "We'll be at your wedding, darling." Dad intervened, his voice firm and clear, without the usual weight of doubt, "with or without your sister. You deserve your perfect day." Relief washed over me like a powerful wave, crushing all my fears and resentments, and I could barely contain my sobs and managed to squeeze out, "Thank you. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." After this conversation, I felt the weight pressing on my shoulders slowly begin to dissipate, like a thick fog under the first ray of sunlight, and with a new sense of determination, I sat down at my desk and, picking up a beautiful gold-edged postcard, carefully wrote an official invitation to our wedding to Christina and Alberto. In closing, he wrote a handwritten note full of sincerity and hope. "I would really like you both to attend the celebration with us. I know it's going to be difficult without the boys, but it's important to me. With love, Isabella." As the weeks passed, bringing us closer to the great day, RSVPs came one after another, in which the guests confirmed their participation, rejoicing with us, but there was no response or news from Christina and Alberto. Their silence became a mute but unequivocal answer, a sad but predictable point in our protracted dispute. And then the wedding day itself came, a day that turned out to be the embodiment of all my dreams. The ceremony was held quietly, solemnly, with respect for every word of our vows. An atmosphere of deep joy and sincere participation reigned in the hall. No one interrupted important moments with shouts or whims. There was no fuss and panic, only warm smiles, whispers of approval, and quiet tears of happiness. During the reception, adults could talk calmly without shouting over the hubbub. The food remained on the plates, not on the floor. The decorations placed with such care remained untouched. The house was filled with light, music, and soft laughter, not crying or screaming, and no one cried out of despair, only Mom, whose tears there were tears of pride and happiness when she watched Osvaldo and me exchange rings and promises of eternal fidelity. "It's wonderful, just wonderful," Aunt Martha told me during dinner, squeezing my hands in her warm palms. "So dignified, so peaceful, honey." Osvaldo, who was sitting next to me, squeezed my hand under the table. His gaze crossed mine, and I knew that he, like me, was thinking about the empty seats at the table where Christina and Alberto should have been sitting, but instead of pain, I felt only quiet sadness mixed with pride for what that we still stayed true to ourselves. A week after we returned from our honeymoon, Mom called me again, and there was a strange mixture of regret and relief in her voice. Christina. Christina hasn't brought the boys since your wedding, she began, pausing. I tried to call her, but she's not answering. She's punishing you for coming to my wedding, I said calmly, without bitterness, just with a light, tired sigh. Maybe, Mom sighed, but you know what? For the first time in many years, my father and I feel refreshed. Our house stays clean by the end of the day. We can have a quiet dinner, read a book, and talk without shouting over someone else. Maybe that's not so bad. I was silent, but inside I understood what she meant. Sometimes, in order to restore broken ties, you need to let them crack to the ground first, in order to see exactly where the invisible cracks lay. And perhaps this was exactly the turning point for our family, the moment when for the first time we stopped pretending that everything was okay, the moment when each of us was forced to honestly face the problems that had been brewing for a long time. I still hoped that one day Christina would understand that my wedding was not an act of hatred for her children. It was not an attempt to exclude them from our lives, but was just a desire to spend a single day in peace and joy, without fear that every important moment would be ruined by uncontrollable chaos. I still hoped that one day she would realize that allowing her children to endlessly break the rules is not a show of love, but a disservice, that without discipline and respect for others they risk growing up selfish and unhappy. I believed that one day we would be able to restore our relationship based on mutual respect, honesty, and a sincere desire to be close, and not out of a sense of duty or guilt. In the meantime, I had memories of an ideal wedding day filled with light and love, surrounded by people who understood and supported my choice without judgment. I had my new husband, my reliable friend and companion, and his loving family who accepted me with an open heart, and I knew that sometimes, to stand up for yourself, even if it hurts, even if it destroys old familiar connections, this is the only right way. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.